Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Unique Items. Today we're going to be taking a look at a unique item which I thought was really interesting when I first discovered it, and it's called the Painter's Servant Torn Gloves. It's a very interesting item that does some very interesting things. Let's go over it together, and we'll talk about the potential connotations of this and what you can do with it. So first off, it does have a energy shield. It is a pure energy shield item. It doesn't really give very much. It does give 5 to 10% fire resistance, 5 to 10% cold resistance, 5 to 10% lightning resistance, which is basically 10% all elemental resistances. Doesn't give you any chaos, though, which is unfortunate. But it does give you at least 10% to all the other resistances. And on top of this, it also converts 33% of all elemental damage into basically another element. So 33% of your fire damage is converted into, or rather, 33% of all of your elements are converted into the other elements. So 33% of elemental damage converted into cold, 33% of elemental damage converted to fire, and 33% of elemental damage converted to lightning. This means that it basically spreads out all your damage into multiple element types. Now, when you look at an ability with these on or off, like for instance, let's take a look at Frostbomb. Frostbomb is primarily cold damage. It's 3,183 to 4,775 cold damage, which is a pretty large amount of cold damage. And you can take these and you can just like run it on a calculator. And you could say, okay, well, what if we took 4,775 and divided it by 3? You would end up around 1,591.66 cold damage for each. With the gloves on, though, you'll find out that it doesn't quite split it up as equally as you would think that it was going to split it up. And this has to do with the fact that it is, of course, still taking part of this and converting it back into cold, which I think is part of the equation. So, like, because 33% is getting converted back into cold and the ability was already doing cold, I think it kind of like stacks on top of itself a little bit. So you always end up with a little bit more of the element that you are native with the ability. So in this particular case, you can see it's a slightly more on the cold than it is on the lightning and the fire. Now, this is kind of like both an interesting upside and it's also kind of a downside as well. So, for instance, in this particular case, because I'm getting my fire, my cold, and my lightning all at the same time, I have the ability to shock targets, I have the ability to freeze targets, and I also have the ability to burn targets with an ability that is primarily cold damage, which is kind of cool. You can utilize this in a lot of different ways that could potentially be to your benefit. Like, for instance, maybe you would like to gain access to an ability like this, which is right, and even I get lost on this tree sometimes. It's right here, 15% increased damage for each type of elemental ailment that is on the enemy. So, for instance, Ignite counts as an elemental ailment, Freeze also does, and so does Shock. So in this particular case, if you were using these gloves, you could definitely get all 3 elemental ailments relatively easily and gain the 15% bonus for each elemental ailment type. On top of this, there's also other modifiers, like for instance this part of the tree right here, which gives you a 30% increased elemental damage if you've chilled an enemy recently, 30% increased elemental damage if you've shocked an enemy recently, and 30% increased elemental damage if you've ignited an enemy recently. So there's a lot of various ways that you can potentially gain benefits by getting access to all of the elements at the same time, which is definitely interesting. There's also this one over here, which is, where is it? 10% increased duration of elemental ailments, 30% increased, not that one. There's so many of them. This one gives you all the exposures. This one also gives you 15% increased damage for each type of elemental ailment on the enemy as well. So that's another 15% for each elemental ailment. In general, there's so many various ways that you can take advantage of multiple element types. Stacking elemental damage instead of specific damage types, utilizing things that give you bonuses for dishing out multiple elements recently. In fact, I'm pretty sure there's one also on here that has something to do with like which elements you've used recently within the past couple seconds. So I think it's like 10 seconds or something like that. That also gives you a damage buff for dishing out multiple types of fire, elemental, or lightning damage. The real problem with these is that they can be a negative in some ways as well. So magnitude of an effect is also crucial in dishing out damage. And to give you an idea of like how crucial magnitude can be, let's go over to my mercenary real quick, and I'm going to show you how magnitude can affect ignite, and how, like, for instance, you might want an ability to, deal more damage rather than having it split evenly between all the effects. As an example, if you use something like Solar Bomb is not a particularly very strong ability, and the ignite damage that it does isn't particularly very strong either. So, as an example, we have our ignite ability here, and then we take a look at the ignite damage, and it's only 554 ignite damage, which isn't the most amazing in the world, right? It's not like crazy. And if we're using something else, like for instance, we're using Explosive Grenade has a higher damage output and could potentially do 628 damage per second with Ignite. However, if we were to utilize something like, say, Plasma Blast to dish out Ignite damage, which is possible, Plasma Blast does a relatively large amount of damage, except it's lightning damage. So we'd have to convert lightning damage into a damage type, which would allow us to do this. So to do that, we're going to convert our lightning damage into cold, and then we're going to use the Three Dragons Mask, which is going to allow us to gain ignite through cold damage. And as you can see here, when my cold damage is 130,000, my ignite damage is 26,176.6. So I can get a much higher ignite damage by utilizing a higher damage output ability. So the more damage that you dish out with some of these abilities, the more damage that you're going to do in general with your ignite. Now, the Painter's Servant Gloves unfortunately makes that bad, because now you're going to lower your fire damage, which means you're also going to lower your ignite, which is unfortunate. So while they can have some good benefits, like allowing you to dish out all elemental ailments with one particular ability, they also provide a negative, which is by lowering the magnitude of those ailments, which means that they may last longer or a lot less time, or they might be harder to build up on a target, depending on what's going on. In my experience, I've had some fun with them, utilizing them to get free ignites and free shocks, essentially. But if you are looking for a higher magnitude version of fire, like if you're trying to get that ridiculous amount of fire damage on your ignite, then you do have to have an attack that does a large amount of damage. There's also some odd interactions with the Painter's Servant's Gloves and conversion abilities or conversion items. So when you put Painter Servant's Gloves on, it pretty much just converts all your damage kind of equally across the board between the elements. And then, of course, you can have bonuses, like, for instance, I'm using Elemental Conflux, so it's constantly switching back and forth between the elements, giving me a bonus on, like, one specific ability or the other. If I turn it off, you'll see more of an even amount, with it being stacked toward cold for some reason, because I guess I just have more cold than others. However, when you put on the rings to convert the elements into various other elements, like, for instance, if I use the Whisper of the Brotherhood Sapphire ring and convert into cold my cold into lightning, you'll notice that my lightning doesn't go away. The Painter's Servant Gloves kind of does some weird things with the conversion abilities, and although it does bring up my lightning damage, which is definitely a thing, it does bring it up. It doesn't completely take away the cold as if I were not wearing the gloves. In most cases, it should be completely removing the cold as an option. So let me go like Explosive Shot. So if we go to Explosive Shot, you'll see cold is just missing entirely. But with the ring, cold comes back because the Painter's Servant Gloves seem to be occurring, I think, maybe after the conversion, which sounds kind of crazy to me, because that means that I'm basically what? I'm taking all of my cold and converting it into lightning, and then this is taking all of my lightning and then converting it back into cold, I guess, or something like that. And to confirm this, I wanted to see, I was like, can I still freeze with my abilities then? Like, does it still allow me to freeze targets? And the answer is yes. Despite the fact that my cold has been completely taken away, the Painter's Servant's Glove basically brought the cold back, which is, I don't know, probably silly and maybe not something that you should probably be doing. It's fun to play around with these items, though, and try to get an idea of what you could potentially be utilizing them for. It's definitely interesting. It's also kind of weird to me that they don't really completely convert to like an even number across the board. It's kind of weird that some abilities just seem to have a much higher damage output in specific elements than others. Like if I look at explosive grenade is what primarily lightning with a little bit of fire. And when I put these on, although it does add fire and cold, the lightning is still the higher number out of the mix. So there's something I'm assuming in the calculations there where it's not quite converting everything. Because my assumption is that you take all the damage numbers and you add them up. And if you take all the damage numbers and add them up without the gloves on, you end up with essentially around the same amount, right? So, like, let's take all the numbers. We take all of our 959, our top ends, so like 1,072, and then we take our 6,428, and then we divide by 3. We get 2,819. But we put the gloves on, and we don't have 2,819. It's close. Like, we got 2,280 for the fire, and we have 2,043 for the cold, but not quite the same. And of course, the lightning, as you can see, is much higher. And in this case, if I take off the ring, converting the cold to the lightning, it seems to be a little bit more equivalent in this particular case. But there are definitely situations where it doesn't seem to quite add up exactly as what it should supposed to be. In fact, Plasma Burst, I think there's something wrong with Plasma Blast, because in Plasma Blast case, it definitely does not convert equally, like in any way, shape, or form. You can look at the ability and you can see that it does 24,000 cold and 22,000 lightning. And when you put the gloves on, we are now doing 8,600 fire, 8,900 lightning, and the cold is still 33,260. It actually goes up significantly with this item for some reason, despite the fact that it should be more or less equalizing them. But instead, it seems to be stealing a large portion from the lightning and actually giving it to the cold. So I'm not exactly sure if the calculations on these gloves are working like as they were intended, or if there's just some hinky stuff going on behind the scenes in terms of how things are being converted. And some of the stuff is not being converted, which is also rather interesting. Anyway, as always, I appreciate you guys and gals joining me, even when we're just talking about a pair of gloves called the Painter's Servant Gloves. The flavor text on these says, "Bloodshed on the crimson shores, longing for the endless sea. Treasures, life, I'd give it all just to capture thee." Be sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.